He could see every heartbeat through his scope. Across the ruined French village, framed between two shattered windows, 3 German soldiers stood in the open, laughing, lighting cigarettes, unaware. One squeeze of the trigger and the war would take them. The young American sniper adjusted his breath, exhaled, and waited for the familiar calm that came before killing. But this time his finger froze. Something inside him refused. In that single hesitation, Private Thomas Beck would discover a truth few soldiers ever faced: that sometimes the hardest shot is the one you do not take. Autumn 1944. The war in Europe was a monster devouring cities and men alike. The Allied advance had pushed deep into France, leaving behind a trail of wreckage and exhausted soldiers who barely remembered peace. Among them was Private Thomas Beck, a 23-year-old farm boy from Kansas, drafted, trained, and turned into a weapon with a rifle that could kill a man half a mile away. Beck served with the 104th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Timberwolves, known for moving silently through the night. He was good, too good. In just 2 months, he had tallied 21 confirmed kills. The men called him the Ghost on the Hill, but behind that reputation hid a mind unraveling under the weight of every trigger pull. His letters home grew shorter, colder. "I don't sleep," he wrote once. "I just count the faces." By late October, his unit reached a ruined village near Aachen, where the war had slowed into deadly patience. The sniper's job was simple: hunt anything wearing gray. Yet as Beck took his position in the upper floor of a collapsed farmhouse, the wind carried a sound he hadn't heard in months: laughter. German soldiers, tired and careless, were sharing a cigarette in the open street, and in that fragile human sound the war suddenly felt wrong. Before the war, Thomas Beck had never killed anything larger than a coyote. He grew up on a wheat farm outside Dodge City, Kansas, a world measured by seasons, not seconds. His father taught him to shoot when he was 12. "Aim small, Miss Small," the old man said, lining up tin cans on a fence. Thomas hit everyone. It wasn't talent he loved. It was the stillness that came just before the shot. That clean-held breath where everything stopped. When war came, that stillness became his curse. In 1943, Beck enlisted like most boys did, out of duty, not hatred. At Camp Rucker, Alabama, instructors noticed his steady aim. Within weeks, he was moved to the sniper program. There they stripped the farm boy from him piece by piece, first his fear, then his conscience. They taught him to fire without flinching, to watch a target fall and move to the next before the body hit the ground. "You don't kill men," the sergeant said. "You remove obstacles." By the time Beck shipped out to Europe, he believed it. His first mission was near the Belgian border, a gray dawn patrol where a German officer appeared on a road. Beck fired once. The man dropped instantly, his cap tumbling into the mud. The spotter clapped his shoulder. "Beautiful shot," he whispered. Beck nodded, but the beauty was already gone. He spent that night staring at his hands, certain he could still feel the trigger beneath his finger. War hardened him quickly. Each kill was recorded, confirmed, and rewarded with rations and a notch on his rifle stock. To his comrades, he was a legend, calm under fire, invisible in chaos. But to himself, he was a stranger. The line between skill and sin grew thinner with each sunrise. Then came Aachen. The city had become a graveyard of stone. Allied artillery had pounded it for weeks, reducing churches to hollow shells and houses to open wounds in the earth. Civilians hid in cellars. Soldiers crawled through rubble like ghosts. Beck's unit moved through it inch by inch, always under the eye of enemy snipers. One morning, while scanning a half-collapsed factory, Beck spotted movement. A German sniper, barely visible. He waited for the man to settle behind his own rifle. The distance was long, the wind steady. Beck exhaled, fired, and watched the figure slump sideways. He reached for his logbook, ready to note another kill. But through his scope, he saw something that froze him. The German wasn't dead yet. The man's hand moved, not toward a weapon, but toward a photograph lying beside him. A small black-and-white image of a woman and a child. Beck watched the trembling fingers brush the paper before going still. For a long moment, the sniper forgot the war entirely. All he saw was a father dying with his family in his hand. That night, Beck didn't write home. He couldn't. Instead, he cleaned his rifle until the metal shone, trying to scrub away a reflection he couldn't escape. His own eyes in the scope, looking back at him. By October, his kills had slowed. His spotter noticed. You're hesitating, the man said. Just picking shots carefully, Beck lied. But the truth was simpler. He no longer believed in his own purpose. Then came the order that would define him. His platoon was to secure a ruined French village used by retreating German forces. Intelligence said a small group remained. Stragglers may be wounded. Beck was assigned overwatch from a farmhouse at the edge of town. You know the drill, the lieutenant told him. Anyone moving in gray, drop them. Beck nodded. The words felt mechanical. He climbed to the upper floor and set up near a shattered window. The air smelled of smoke and wet brick. Through the scope, the streets below were still, empty except for drifting papers and the flicker of sunlight on broken glass. Then he saw them. 3 German soldiers, barely 20, laughing beside a burned-out truck. They passed a cigarette between them, shoulders slumped with exhaustion. They looked more like farmhands than enemies. Beck adjusted his scope. The crosshair hovered on the chest of the one in the middle. He could see the match flare, the smoke curl. One squeeze. Just one. But the stillness that once steadied him now felt suffocating. He remembered the photograph by the dead sniper's hand. He thought of his own mother's kitchen, the smell of bread, his father's voice, aim small, miss small. He lowered the rifle. Then raised it again, then stopped. For the first time since the war began, Thomas Beck didn't know which side he was on. The wind outside the farmhouse was gentle, carrying the faint sound of church bells from somewhere beyond the hills, a sound that didn't belong in war. Thomas Beck lay prone behind the broken window frame, his rifle balanced on a sandbag, crosshairs fixed on the 3 German soldiers who stood unaware of their watcher. They weren't doing anything that justified dying. They weren't aiming weapons or setting traps. They were just living. One soldier, barely a man, struggled to light his cigarette against the breeze. Another teased him, laughing with the easy warmth of friends who had shared too many nights in the cold. It was a scene that should have been harmless. And yet it existed inside a war where every gesture was suspicious, every shadow dangerous. Beck's training screamed at him. Target visible. Distance clear. Take the shot. But something in him refused. He looked again through the scope, at the curve of their shoulders, the casual tilt of the head. He imagined them back home. Maybe farmers like him, just wearing the wrong uniform at the wrong time. He had seen too much death to pretend anymore that killing solved anything. He adjusted the safety catch and whispered to himself, "Not today." Behind him, his spotter, Corporal Lane, noticed the hesitation. "You waiting for something?" Lane muttered. "They're not a threat," Beck answered. Lane frowned. "Orders are clear. Anything in gray." Beck said nothing. Lane peered through his binoculars. 3 of them right there in the open. "This is a gift, Beck. You could drop them before they blink." Beck's voice was calm but strange, as if speaking to himself more than Lane. "I could. That's the problem." Lane stared at him. "You going soft?" Beck didn't answer. Moments passed in silence. The Germans finished their cigarette and moved toward a small well in the center of the street. One of them limped. Another helped him walk. Beck's finger twitched on the trigger. That instinct drilled into him over months of training. Every muscle in his arm begged for release, but he saw the limp, saw the exhaustion, and suddenly the image twisted in his mind. 3 men not as targets, but as victims of the same endless machine that had chewed through millions. He lowered his rifle. "I'm done," he whispered. Lane blinked. "What did you say?" Beck turned away from the window. "You take the shot if you want it." Lane hesitated, then aimed. Through his own scope, he lined up the target. But as he prepared to fire, one of the Germans reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. He smiled faintly, showing it to the others. A wife, a child, the universal ghosts every soldier carried. Lane exhaled and lowered his weapon. "Hell," he muttered. "You're contagious." For the rest of that day, neither man fired. That night, the lieutenant stormed into the farmhouse. "You had clear targets," he barked. Beck stood at attention. "Sir, they were unarmed." "Unarmed Nazis are still Nazis, Private. You had your orders." "With respect, sir, killing them wouldn't have changed a thing." The lieutenant's jaw tightened. "Your job isn't to decide morality. It's to end the war faster." Beck held his gaze. "If killing for no reason ends the war, maybe it's the wrong kind of war." There was a silence thick enough to choke on. Finally, the lieutenant said coldly, "You're relieved from sniper duty." Report to the medic station. Maybe they can fix whatever's broken in your head. Beck saluted, turned, and walked out. He didn't know whether to feel punished or free. Days later, the village changed hands again. German artillery shelled it from a distance, turning familiar ruins into dust. Beck and Lane were ordered to help evacuate the wounded. As Beck moved through the rubble, he saw faces, both American and German, twisted in the same silent pain. By late afternoon, they reached the edge of town where the well once stood. The ground was cratered, the air full of ash. Amid the destruction, Beck noticed a small object half buried in the dirt, a bent photograph. He picked it up carefully. The edges were scorched, but the image was still visible. A young man holding a baby smiling in sunlight. It was him. One of the soldiers from that morning, the one he hadn't shot. Beck stood there for a long time, staring at the photograph while artillery rumbled in the distance. He realized the man might be dead now anyway. Maybe a shell had found him. Maybe not. There was no way to know. But he also realized something deeper. Mercy didn't guarantee survival. It only guaranteed humanity. He slipped the photograph into his breast pocket. That night, in a half-destroyed barn, Beck wrote a letter home, his first in weeks. "Dear Mom," he began, "I didn't take the shot today. I don't know if that makes me a coward or something else. But for the first time I felt like myself again." He folded the letter carefully, though he never sent it. The next morning, his unit moved on toward the German border. Beck was reassigned as a scout. No rifle, no scope. Just a map and compass. But the war wasn't done testing him yet. A week later, outside Cologne, his patrol stumbled upon a group of civilians trapped between retreating German troops and advancing Allied tanks. Shells exploded around them. The air was thick with smoke and screams. Beck and Lane crawled forward under fire to guide the civilians to safety. As they reached the last group, Beck froze. Among them were 3 young men in torn German uniforms, unarmed, hands raised. It was impossible to know if they were the same men he'd spared days earlier, but the resemblance struck him like lightning. They were terrified, shivering, barely standing. The American sergeant behind Beck shouted, "Don't waste time, leave them." But Beck turned back. "They're surrendering!" he yelled. "They'll slow us down." The sergeant snapped. "Then I'll slow down with them." For the second time, Thomas Beck made a choice that defied war itself. He waved the Germans forward, shouting for them to follow. Together, they crawled through the ruins toward Allied lines. When they finally reached safety, one of the Germans stumbled and fell. Beck caught him before he hit the ground. The young man looked up through the grime and whispered something in broken English. "Danke, thank you." Beck nodded, breathless, covered in soot. "Don't thank me," he said quietly. "Just live." That night, under a sky streaked with tracer fire, Beck lay awake listening to the distant thunder of artillery. He no longer felt like a sniper or even a soldier. He felt like a witness, someone who had seen the edge of what men could become and refused to step over it. The next day, Captain Ellis reinstated him to sniper duty. "Command thinks you're wasted as a scout," Ellis said. "You're one of the best shots in Europe." Beck looked at him and replied softly, "Then maybe I'm wasted on war." Ellis stared at him for a long moment, then handed him a rifle anyway. "Take it," he said. "Maybe one day you'll find something worth aiming at again." The war did not end with victory parades or cheers. It ended the way a storm ends, not with a roar, but with a whisper. By the spring of 1945, the thunder of artillery had drifted into memory. The Allied advance pressed deep into Germany, moving through towns that looked less like places than like wounds. The streets were quiet except for the sound of boots stepping through broken glass. Flags were torn, doors hung open, and faces stared from shattered windows. The faces of survivors who had forgotten how to speak. Thomas Beck walked among them like a ghost. He carried no rifle now. His sniper's scope had been confiscated after the riverbank incident, an unspoken punishment for an unspoken disobedience. His new duty was menial, loading trucks, repairing bridges, counting supplies. He didn't mind. The stillness he'd once sought through a scope now came through repetition. The scrape of crates, the hum of engines, the sound of anything that wasn't a heartbeat in his ear. When news of Germany's surrender reached his unit, the men erupted. Helmets flew into the air. Rifles fired celebratory rounds into the open sky. Some wept openly, hugging each other, shouting names of towns they'd never see again. Beck stood apart, watching the fireworks of tracer rounds fade into smoke. His captain found him sitting alone on a broken wall, overlooking the Rhine River. "Hell of a view, isn't it?" the captain said. Beck nodded, silent. The older man hesitated. "I read your file. About the bridge." Beck didn't look at him. "You gonna court-martial me, sir?" The captain sighed. "No, war's over. What would be the point?" They sat in silence. The river rolled beneath them, carrying the ashes of 1,000 battles toward the sea. "For what it's worth," the captain finally said, "you probably did the right thing." Beck turned. "Right?" he echoed, his voice almost bitter. "You mean not killing a man who spared me first?" The captain frowned. "You think he was the same one?" Beck nodded faintly. Same hands. Same stillness. He stared at the horizon, the setting sun bleeding into the water. "Maybe we were both tired," he whispered. The captain said nothing. There was nothing to say. When Beck stepped off the train in Kansas 3 months later, the air smelled of wheat and rain. The station was nearly empty. A few returning soldiers, a few waiting families. His mother spotted him first, waving frantically. His father stood beside her, hat in hand, expression unreadable. "Tommy!" she cried, wrapping her arms around him. "You came home." He hugged her, breathing in the scent of soap and soil, the smell of a life that hadn't changed even if he had. His father shook his hand, firm and quiet. "You came back whole, son. That's what matters," Beck smiled faintly. "Not all of me," he said. His father didn't ask what that meant. Life on the farm resumed like a film spliced back together after missing frames. The field still stretched to the horizon. The sun still rose red through the haze, and the wind still whispered through the wheat. But everything felt hollow, as if the world had been rebuilt without its soul. The rifle that once hung over the mantel now leaned forgotten in a corner. Beck couldn't bring himself to touch it. When coyotes came at night killing livestock, his father asked him to take care of it. Beck lifted the rifle, aimed, and then froze. The stillness returned, the same stillness that had once steadied him on foreign soil. But now it made his stomach turn. He lowered the gun and walked back to the house. "I can't," he muttered. His father said nothing, only stared after him with a confusion that looked too much like pity. Months passed. Beck rarely spoke about the war. Neighbors called him the quiet one, the veteran who spent evenings sitting on the fence watching sunsets as if waiting for something to rise from the fields. Sometimes local children saw him polishing his rifle, though he never loaded it. He would run a cloth along the barrel slowly, reverently, as if cleaning a memory he couldn't throw away. At night, the dreams came. A burst of laughter echoing down a ruined street, a match flaring in the dark. The river glinting beneath a sniper's scope. Each dream ended the same way, with a voice whispering, "You could have killed them all." He woke drenched in sweat, the sound of a shot ringing in his ears that he had never fired. He started writing again. Not letters, just thoughts, fragments of what he couldn't say aloud. The war doesn't end when the guns go quiet. It ends when you forgive yourself for not becoming what it asked you to be. In 1963, nearly 20 years later, a letter arrived with a German postmark. The envelope was thin, the handwriting neat and deliberate. He opened it at the kitchen table, hands trembling slightly. "My name is Elsa. When I was a little girl, I lived in a town by the river. A soldier in your uniform could have killed my father that day, but he didn't. He lowered his rifle and let us go. My father told me to find him one day, to tell him that because of that mercy I lived. If you are that man, know that we never forgot. You did not lose your soul that day. You saved ours." Beck read the letter 3 times. The room was silent except for the ticking of an old clock. He looked out the window, at the same fields he'd known since childhood, and felt something inside him finally exhale. He realized that his act of restraint had not disappeared into the fog of war. It had rippled across decades, across oceans, into the heart of a woman who had once been a terrified child. And maybe he thought that was what mercy really was, not forgiveness, but survival shared between strangers. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his jacket pocket. From that day on, he carried it everywhere, to the fields, to town, even to bed. It became his proof that what he'd done had meaning, that silence could echo louder than a gunshot. Years passed. His hair turned gray, his hands roughened with age. The letter's paper yellowed, but he never let it out of his sight. When he died in 1988, the coroner found it still tucked inside his coat, worn and folded but legible. At his funeral, the pastor spoke of faith, family, and service. But when they lowered his casket into the ground, his sister read a single line from the note aloud, the one Beck had underlined in pencil. "You did not lose your soul that day." His headstone carried no rank, no medals, no mention of the war. Just a name, 2 dates, and 5 simple words chosen by his sister. In the years that followed, stories like Beck's faded from history's loud pages. The headlines remembered victories, not mercy. Museums displayed rifles and flags, not letters. But in some quiet archives, in old field reports, diaries, and forgotten testimonies wanged, the truth still breathes. That the war was shaped not only by those who fought, but by those who refused to lose themselves while fighting. Thomas Beck never claimed to be a hero. He was a man who looked through a rifle's scope and saw, for one brief heartbeat, something sacred, the thin thread that connects enemy and friend, killer and savior. And when he chose not to pull the trigger, he didn't just save a life. He saved the part of himself that could still believe in one. He could have killed them all, but instead he gave the world a moment of grace that history almost forgot.